One of my high school teachers once described a philosopher as someone who thinks really hard about things. And to this day, I think that might be the best definition of philosophy I've ever seen. Philosophers are people who think about life's most important questions and use reason and logic to try to figure out what's true. Now, one of these deeper questions that philosophers try to figure out is religion. And as a philosophy undergraduate student, I try to model the behavior of a philosopher in everything I think about. So I've thought really hard about the question of religion, asking myself whether any particular religion is true. And doing this, I've come squarely to the belief that the Catholic religion is true, while all other religions are either not true at all or only somewhat true, partially true. And in this video, I'm going to try to trace my reasoning for this position from the very beginning to the very end, using reason and logic to answer what I think is one of the most important questions that can be asked. Now, as those familiar with Catholicism will know, all of Catholic doctrine revolves around this idea that there exists a being who created the world and sustains it in existence, a being who is all good, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, perfectly simple, and this is the being that Catholics call God. And while it may seem like a perfectly reasonable starting point for a philosophical analysis of Catholicism to start by asking what philosophy has to say about whether or not God exists, I think there's an even more fundamental question to ask first. A question so fundamental that none of us really think about it, but one that will shape everything we say from here on out. Before we can ask whether or not God exists, we have to ask whether anything exists at all. After all, about 500 years ago, there was a philosopher by the name of Descartes, René Descartes, who argued that we can't know with certainty that anything exists outside ourselves. We may think we see and touch and smell a world outside us, but sometimes our senses are wrong. I'm sure we've all had moments when we think that someone we see off in the distance is someone we know, but when we get close, we realize, oh wait, that was totally someone else. Maybe you've walked into a house thinking you smell some kind of food, and then when you're actually eating the food, you realize, oh wait, this is something totally different than what I thought I smelled. Or to take a more extreme example, imagine you're in a desert and you haven't eaten or drunk anything in days, and all of a sudden you think you see a oasis off in the distance, but it turns out that this was a mirage, this was an illusion. Sometimes our senses deceive us. So how can we know that they're not deceiving us all the time? How can we ever trust our senses when they say that there's a world outside of us? And here's the thing. The short answer is that we can't really. We can never have absolute logical certainty that a world outside of us exists and that we're not living in the Matrix or something, or that life isn't one big dream or a mirage. But we don't need absolute logical certainty. It's unrealistic and unhuman to expect absolute certainty in everything. You can only doubt so much before you start to go insane. If I lived my whole life never trusting my senses, I wouldn't be able to live a human life. Let's say I wanted to go to the door to my basement. I wanted to go to my basement. Can I be absolutely sure that when I open that door, I won't find my basement replaced with a pit of lava? No, there's always a possibility. But if I lived my life anticipating pits of lava on the side of every door, I'd never open a door. To live a real life, we have to accept some things as practically certain, even if they're not logically certain. There are certain things that we just can't doubt and retain our sanity. The existence of a real world outside ourselves is one of those things. Another of those self-evident, undoubtable things is the reality of change. If we don't believe that the change we see around us, or that at least we think we see around us, is real, we'll go crazy. When I open my basement door, I'm really opening that basement door. The door is really moving. When I get out of bed in the morning, I'm really getting out of bed. I'm really changing my location. When the leaves fall from the tree in the fall, they're really falling. Change is real. All this might seem like obvious common sense, but if there's one thing I've learned in 2 years of undergraduate philosophy classes, it's that philosophers are painfully good at doubting obvious common sense. 2,500 years ago, there was a philosopher named Parmenides who gave arguments for why he thought that change can't be real, and that anytime we think we see something changing, we're being deceived. Think about it, he said. If change was real, It would mean something would have to exist which didn't exist before. But it's a basic philosophical principle that something cannot come from nothing. Being cannot come out of non-being, but being would have to come out of non-being if change is ever going to occur. Something would have to be, which at one point did not be. That means that change can't be real. And when our senses tell us that something's changing, they're lying to us. If Parmenides' argument is right, change is metaphysically impossible. And it's hard to see the flaw in his argument. So some of us maybe might be willing to accept his conclusion and deny that change exists. But to doubt the existence of change is to doubt something that, if not logically impossible, is practically impossible. Everything we do, everything we see, everything we think is built around this idea of change. If change wasn't real, it's not just that some part of life is an illusion, it would be that all of life is an illusion. Everything we think we see revolves around change. If change was just totally fake, then everything we think we see is just totally fake. When you think you're getting out of bed, that's your mind playing a trick on you. Because to go from being in bed to being not in bed is a change. When you think you killed the mosquito that just landed on you, then that's also your mind playing a trick on you. Because a mosquito's death is a change in the mosquito. And if you think you discovered that your mind's playing a trick on you, well, that's a change too. Because to go from not knowing that your mind's playing a trick on you to knowing that your mind's playing a trick on you is a change. So if we don't believe that change is real, life becomes unlivable. We would have to conclude that every single experience we have is false, because every experience involves change. So we have to believe that there's a mistake in Parmenides' reasoning. We have to. The only question is what that mistake is. And it was this effort to prove Parmenides wrong and to find out what his mistake is that motivated the careers of the two most famous philosophers to ever live, Plato and Aristotle. These intellectual giants offer their own explanations for where Parmenides' argument went wrong. But I'm going to focus on Aristotle's explanation here, because I think it's the strongest of the two. That being said, I also think that Plato's account for change could draw us to the same conclusion I'm going to reach here in a second, if we follow it to its logical culmination. But remember first that Parmenides' argument revolved around this idea that change requires something to come out of nothing. And since something cannot come out of nothing, therefore change is not real. What Plato and Aristotle both deny is exactly that. It's the idea that change involves something coming out of nothing. Aristotle does this by arguing that there exists a kind of in-between state between being and not being. And he calls this potential. Now, potential is real, but it's not as real as something that's really real, something that's actual. If a thing has a potential to be another way, the way it could be really does exist, but only as a potential. If there's a pencil that has the potential to be snapped in two, then the quality snapped in two really exists in the pencil to some degree, but not as much as it would if the pencil was really snapped in two. This allows Aristotle to say that change isn't something coming from nothing, but something coming from less, something coming from less being from less being, which isn't metaphysically absurd like something coming from nothing. Change for Aristotle is just the actualization of a potential. It's something which is potential or somewhat real becoming actual or really real. If we see something change, it's because something that was once potential in the thing is becoming more real, more actual. Actuality and potentiality exist side by side in everything we see changing, with change occurring whenever a potential thing becomes actual. But how can a potential thing become an actual thing? How can a potential gain actuality? For change to happen, something has to give a potential thing actuality. But what could do that? Well, it clearly can't be another potential thing, since nothing can give what it does not have. And by definition, potential things don't have actuality. That's what makes them potential things and not actual things. So it must be an actual thing which gives a potential thing actuality and makes it actual. Wherever we see change, what's going on metaphysically under the surface is that an actual thing is lending some of its actuality to the potential thing. and thereby making that potential thing an actual thing and giving that potential thing the power to make other potential things actual. So this world of changing things is really a world of things that are part actual and part potential, passing actuality back and forth between themselves. Think of it like a football team lining up across the field and passing the ball back and forth between each other for practice. One team member only has the ball at any one moment because his teammate passed it to him. And it's only because he got the ball from his teammate that he's able to pass it on to his other teammate. Actuality is like that. A potential thing only becomes actual when it is given actuality by another actual thing, thereby making that potential thing an actual thing and bestowing it the ability to make other potential things actual things. And this football image here actually gives us a really good way to start thinking about the next question I'm going to ask. If the world is full of seemingly endless series of potential things receiving actuality, becoming actual, and then passing on that actuality to other potential things, here's the question. What exactly is this thing, actuality, that these things are passing between themselves? Just like we can ask what the football players are passing along to each other and discover that it's a football, we can ask what the changing things of this world are passing among each other and try to discern its attributes, try to figure out what it's like. What is actuality like, we can ask, considered apart from any particular actual thing? What is actuality itself? Well, if there's one thing that actuality must be, it's actual. Actuality considered by itself must be purely actual, without any mixture of potential. Otherwise, it wouldn't be actuality itself, it would be actuality plus some kind of potential. But if pure actuality doesn't have any kind of potentials, then it can't change. So whatever pure actuality is, it doesn't change. Now this entails two things. First, since time is a measure of change, actuality considered by itself must be outside of time, since the thing that time is measuring, change, doesn't apply to it. Also, it must not be made out of material stuff, any kind of material stuff at all, because anything that's made out of material stuff is always liable to change. As long as something is material, it can be changed by other material things. You can try to find a counterexample to this if you don't believe me, but I promise you it doesn't exist. Matter is by nature changing, and every material thing we see around us confirms this. And if we really just think about what it means to be material, we realize that makes sense because matter is made up of parts, and parts are always able to be broken down and divided and rearranged in a different way. Matter is, just according to common sense, ever changing. So, pure actuality must be changeless and timeless and immaterial. But more than that, it must be singular, one singular being. After all, if there was more than one thing which is purely actual, then we would have to have a way to distinguish pure actuality 1 from pure actuality 2 by pointing to some quality or property that one of them has that the other one doesn't. But pure actuality doesn't lack any kind of property or quality, because then it could be changeable. It could change if it gained the thing it lacked, or if it lost some part of it. And we've already established that it can't change, because then it would have to have some kind of potential. To put it more simply, if there was more than one thing which is purely actual, more than one pure actuality, one of them would have to have some potentiality to differentiate it from the other purely actual thing. And that's absurd, because then it wouldn't be purely actual. So there can only be one purely actual thing. And this singularness of pure actuality actually goes even further. Not only can there not be distinctions between different purely actual things, but that one thing which is purely actual can't even have any kind of distinctions within itself. In other words, it can't have any parts, because if it had parts, those parts could potentially come apart. And this thing could potentially change, which it can't by definition. So now we have this single thing, which is purely actual, a thing which is changeless, timeless, immaterial, and doesn't have any parts. But philosophy can tell us more about this thing. After all, if this thing is purely actual, it can't lack any kind of actuality. So any kind of actuality, any kind of perfection of being, this thing must have in fullness. But if that's the case, it must be all good, since goodness is a perfection. And all powerful, since power is a perfection. And all knowing, because knowledge is a perfection. So goodness, knowledge, and powers are all perfections of being, and pure actuality must have all perfections of being in order to be purely actual. So pure actuality must be all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And finally, this thing must be both transcendent and immaterial, both beyond the world and intimately tied to it. As pure actuality, it is fundamentally different from and infinitely greater than any other only partially actual thing that exists in this world. And that's everything, except this one purely actual thing, because, like we've said, pure actuality is one of a kind. But at the same time, it must permeate everything that exists, must be present to all actual things, like the football is present to the quarterback passing it. Actuality is both beyond the world and present in every spot of it, infinitely distant from us and at the very center of our being at the same time. Now this, I realize, is a very strange thing to think about. Something that is infinite, but only one, all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing, but without any division in its power, knowledge, or goodness, and above all, and yet in us. Nevertheless, I have to believe this thing exists in order to account for the reality of change. A basic observation of reality that I can't deny without losing my mind and abandoning the commonest of common sense. And here I can add one more element to the equation, a piece of the puzzle that will really put a capstone on showing exactly what this paradoxical being, which is purely actual, we're talking about is. Remember I said that this thing must have an infinite amount of knowledge. Now, the only thing that can have knowledge is a mind, for knowledge involves thinking, and minds are the only things that do thinking, right? So, people have knowledge, rocks and blind forces don't. That means that this thing we have arrived at, this thing that we've been calling purely actual, pure actuality, this thing that must exist in order for change to be real and not just a hallucination, is a mind. And more than that, it must be an infinite mind, if it's going to hold an infinite amount of knowledge and be all-knowing. So there must be a great mind, a personal being now, transcendent to reality and present in everything that exists, down to the last molecule, a thing with infinite power, knowledge, and goodness, a thing outside of time, space, and the realm of change in order to explain a basic, undeniable, manifest truth about the way the world works. This, of course, is exactly what the three main monotheistic religions of the world, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, mean when they talk about God. So what Aristotle inadvertently gave us while trying to show how change is real is an argument for the existence of God. What's more, this is a metaphysical argument, grounded in unchanging metaphysical principles. The conclusion follows in all times and places, so no new discovery in physics or biology or history could dethrone it. Metaphysics carries a level of endurance and certainty that these other disciplines don't. So that's why this is a really strong argument. And so that's why, everything I've gone over so far, that's why I, a philosophy student, believe in God. I can't deny the existence of change, and I can't explain the existence of change without accepting the existence of God. But now, I can ask myself the follow-up question. If God exists, and he is ever present throughout the world, has he ever revealed himself to humanity? Note that this is now a historical question instead of a philosophical one. Does God exist is a question for philosophy, but did God speak to this person on this day at 11 p.m. is a question for history and empirical evidence. So, truth to be told, I'm a bit out of my wheelhouse here. I'm a philosophy student, So I know much more about the philosophical arguments for God than the historical arguments for Christianity. Nevertheless, I know enough about the case for the historical validity of Christianity to find it convincing, and very convincing, in fact. And I hope that I know it well enough to communicate the case to you in a way that will at least pique your interest. So remember I said that the God that we, following Aristotle, just arrived at through philosophy perfectly corresponds to the God of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. They believe that God has all those attributes. Those three religions all believe that God has all those attributes that Aristotle and me and hopefully you now understand this being which is purely actual to have. So given that we know that the claim that this kind of God exists must be true, and that truth cannot contradict truth, we know that any religion which denies the existence of this kind of God can't be true. So that would include religions like Greek or Norse paganism, which argue that the gods were material beings, because God can't be a material being. Or Mormonism, which argued that God was once a man, and that he therefore had a beginning in time, which would deny God's timelessness. It also precludes pantheism, or the belief that God is identical to the world, since we know that pure actuality must be above the world. And obviously, atheism and agnosticism are ruled out if God exists, too, because God exists, so you can't be an atheist or an agnostic. So if any religion is correct, it has to be one of those three which accept the belief in a purely actual God. Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Catholicism is just a subset of Christianity. And this is the point where we turn to the doctrines of these religions to see if we can use history to find out if their claims to revelation are true. And here we're in luck, because as it turns out, all three religions have something to say about one man who lived about 2,000 years ago, Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity believed that he rose from the dead. Islam and Judaism go out of their way to say that he didn't. So here we have a chance to knock off a couple birds with one stone. If I can use history to find out that the resurrection of Jesus really happened, then I can eliminate Islam and Judaism as options, because they say that it didn't. And if I can use history to find out that the resurrection didn't happen, well, then there goes Christianity. And here's where I come down squarely on the side that the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical event. The guy really did walk out of his tomb over almost 2,000 years ago, after being executed by Roman officials. My basic argument comes down to the witness of the apostles, who claimed to see Jesus rise from the dead, apostles who we know held to that belief despite harsh persecution, with many of them dying brutal deaths on account of their claim that Jesus rose from the dead. Endurance in the face of persecution definitely doesn't prove a belief is true, but it does show that someone truly believed the belief. And the actions of the apostles show that they certainly believed Jesus rose from the dead. So now what we have to do is figure out why they believed that. And when we think about all the options of why the apostles might have thought that Jesus rose from the dead, one stands out above all the others. The one that says that he actually did rise from the dead. The apostles could not have hallucinated a risen Jesus, as is sometimes suggested, because that would require dozens of people having the same hallucination, which doesn't happen. They couldn't have been deceived into thinking someone was Jesus when he really wasn't, because we know from primary sources dated to within decades of Jesus' life that the apostles were all friends and acquaintances of Jesus, and the kind of close friends that you don't mistake someone else for. If they saw Jesus, they would know whether or not it's him. And when we consider how we already know from philosophy that God exists, and that he has control over all the forces of nature, because he made them, and not the other way around, miracles like someone rising from the dead become possible. For death and decay are just more of those forces that God made and that he has control over. If God really exists, then the resurrection is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And unlikely things happen all the time. Does the claim that human beings once traveled to the moon sound unlikely? Yeah, until someone shows you moon landing footage. Unlikely things happen all the time. And we believe unlikely things whenever there's evidence for them. And I have come to believe firmly in the resurrection as one of those unlikely historical realities which has evidence for it. But this still leaves us with a bit of a question. Why Jesus? Why would God wave aside the usual pattern of people dying and staying dead for this one random guy in the Middle East? Now, if we look at what Jesus said during his life, we might get a clue for that. And thankfully, we have much more historical data for Jesus' life than we have with most major historical figures from that era. We have, to start, 4 biographies dated to within a couple decades of his life. We call them the 4 Gospels. And looking at these documents simply as historical documents, not as divine revelation, we're not doing that yet, just as historical documents, like we would with any other ancient biography, we discovered that Jesus claimed to be God. And more than that, he claimed that he would rise from the dead. That's funny. And he also claimed that by rising from the dead, he would vindicate his claim to be God. And given Jesus' Jewish backgrounds, when he claimed to be God, he was claiming to be the same all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing, all that other stuff being that we just showed following Aristotle must exist. Because that was the kind of God the Jews believed in. No wonder then that Jesus claimed to have the power to rise from the dead. If he was God, and God is all-powerful, then he would have the power to rise from the dead, because God is all-powerful. So we have reason to trust Jesus when he claims a divine nature, because Jesus being God incarnate explains why he did the very unusual thing of rising from the dead. And if Jesus is God, and God is all good, then we can trust whatever he says. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is recorded to have said to one of his disciples, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Jesus told Simon Peter that he would establish a church, and that this church would continue in existence until the end of time. The gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it, that kind of thing. More than this, he gave Peter a special authority over that church. Peter's name change from Simon to Peter marks that connection. Jesus said his church would be built upon a rock, and Peter is the masculine version of the word rock in the ancient Greek that forms Matthew's gospel. Jesus promised Peter that whatever he bound on earth would be loosed in heaven. In other words, Jesus was giving Peter absolute power over what's true in heaven, promising that whatever Peter said would be true. That's a powerful promise. That's a really powerful promise, and one that raises a question. Where is this church today? And where's that special power that Jesus bestowed upon Peter today? If Jesus promised that Peter's church would endure until the end of time, and time hasn't ended yet, we should expect to see it somewhere. So where is it? And here we find that there's only one church that has existed in an unbroken chain of succession from the time of Christ: the Catholic Church. More than that, the Catholic Church's leader, the Pope, can trace his authority all the way back to the special authority Jesus bestowed on Peter, because the popes, too, have existed in an unbroken line of succession, pope after pope after pope after pope after pope, for 2,000 years. We know who St. Peter's successor was, and we know who his successor was, and we know who his successor was, all the way up until modern times. If Jesus promised Peter special authority, and Peter vested his authority in his successor, and that successor vested that authority in his successor, on and on and on and on, all the way up until modern times, then it stands to reason that Peter's authority exists all the way up until modern times. And all the historical data we have shows that this is exactly what happened. Our earliest Christian testimony highlights how the early church had a special reverence for the authority of the Bishop of Rome, stemming from the fact that Peter died as Bishop of Rome, and his successor was the next Bishop of Rome. St. Ignatius of Antioch, for example, writing in the early 2nd century, so really early on. I've heard once that the Apostle John was still alive when St. Ignatius was writing these lines, referred to the Roman Church, so the church at the city of Rome, as, quote, the church which holds the presidency. No wonder the church has survived all the perils the world has thrown at it. It was promised by the all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-present, infinite, perfectly simple source and sustainer of all that is, that the gates of the netherworld would never prevail against it. And if there's any being we can trust at all in this whole world, it's that one. And thank you for watching this video. Someone has pointed out to me that saying what I'm about to say is actually presupposing the conclusion I'm trying to use in this video, but I'm going to say it anyway. God bless. And also, if you can like and subscribe and do all that stuff, I'd really appreciate it. So thank you, and God bless.